Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you today, guys. I'm going to try and look in at the camera like I failed to do in recent videos, but hopefully in this video I can succeed. So before I move on to my topic, which is going to be returning to linguistic type, just remember that this book has been nearly out a year. I think it came out mid-September or something like that of last year. And it's yeah, it's lovely, deepest investigation of the INFJ you'll find. 58 reviews now, or 58 reviews on Amazon, average of 4.4. It's really, if you want to go deep, you just read the comments on the Amazon, and I think they speak for themselves. I don't know these people, but I am grateful that they got the book. And they will all say basically that if you want to dive deep into the INFJ personality, this is the book to get. And it's a beautiful addition to your bookshelf because it's a very nice product, right? I also want to mention that I've actually got a new book coming out very soon. It's called The Infinite Castle. It's what you might call it's basically an existentialist, or I call it a post-existentialist novel. If you like your Dostoevsky or Kafka, your Murakami as well. If you like your combination of modernism and postmodernism, sometimes referred to as meta-modernism. And also, for the purposes of this channel, if you're interested in looking at a character, main character, spoken first person, character is not me, but I could say, an INFJ character viewed through the lens of at least it's open interpretation whether the character has mental illness. And if you're interested in the idea of diving deep into a story that explores these topics, so in a way, there is a link between the Ecstatic Soul and the Infinite Castle, which is the title of the new novel, in the sense that I think that you could read the Infinite Castle as in the phenomenological exploration of a certain type of INFJ character in the fictional setting and everything, and it has a lot more going on in the story than just this. But I have included a link to the pre-order for the ebook if you're interested in getting a hold of the ebook. If you would rather get the paperback, the pre-order will be available next week, and I'm hoping maybe the next video, hopefully I'll have the book in hand, and I'll be able to present it formally. The Infinite Castle, 250 pages or give or take. I think the book is going to look really great. The cover, again, beautiful addition to your bookshelf. I'll include a link to like a kind of mock-up presentation of what the book in its physical form will look like, in the link below if you want to have a look. So now, in terms of moving back to our topic of linguistic type, because it's been a while since I've made a video on linguistic type. This is episode 4, technically speaking. And in the first episode, I was discussing, what would linguistic typology try to do, and in what way it was seeking to be one possible approach to an objective assessment of type. In episode 2, I presented the wait a second, because I did talk about the contrast between direction of fit and mind toward direction of fit and word to mind direction of fit. That was in episode 1. Episode 0 was kind of the presentation of the approach. Episode 2, I distinguished between N statements and S statements, if you remember. And in episode 3, I was answering a number of comments that I had gotten. Now, in this episode, I want, in light of some comments that were provided, particularly on the video on N statements versus S statements, to offer what could be described as a further elucidation of NE language, NE writing. So we would be diving a bit deeper into a specific kind of manifestation of a function, and to distinguish it from SE. Right, so we're not talking about NRSI, we're specifically talking about NE versus SE in this particular video. So the first thing to say is that I think that when it comes to statements of extroverted judgment versus statements of introverted judgments, the mind to world direction of it versus world to mind direction of it is something that so far I want to stick to. I have not read comments that defeat the view. I mean, of course, there are nuances that can be brought into the approach, but I've not seen anything that defeats the view. Now, in the case of N versus S statements, where I offered the distinction in terms of symmetry versus isomorphism, I think that there were a number of comments that I thought were important and interesting challenges to the view, and in a way I could boil it down by saying that the distinction is not precise enough, and I understand. So in this video I want to try to see if I could get more precise in terms of distinguishing between SE statements versus NE statements. So when I say SE statements versus NE statements, I don't mean necessarily that those would be the statements of an SE dominant versus an NE dominant, but of an NE user versus an SE user. So that also means, and it's something that you have to keep in mind, that that the SE user could be an N user if they're SE, say an ENFJ, for example, whose SE is tertiary, and the NE user could be an S user, ESFJ, ESTJ, whose NE is tertiary, or even ISTJ. You could even include those cases. It's easier if we look at NE users of the INFP sort, of the INTP sort, of course, and SE users of the ESTP sort, of the ISTP sort. But in theory, you could expand the sample of people to include, cases of NEUs and S users and SEUs and N users. That's perfectly fine, because that's just what the theory is telling us about the hierarchy of functions in different types of users. So you imagine that you have a type that has NE developed, whether that type is an N user or an S user, and then you imagine another type that has SE developed, whether that type is an S user or an N user, and they're making a statement. Now, any kind of statement, note that this statement that they make could very well be a statement of a judging statement. In other words, a judgment that makes a claim to truth. If that statement makes a claim to truth, we already know that the distinction between whether it's dominated by JI or JE is going to be in terms of the direction of fit. If it's the mind to world statement, it's going to be dominated by JI. If it's the world to mind direction of fit, it's going to be directed by JE. But once we've said that and we've identified the direction of fit of the particular statement, the sort of the mechanism governing, the truth regime of what determines the truth of the statements, whether it's fitting the world or the world fitting the mind, we still are finding ourselves with a bunch of words arranged in a sentence, maybe a paragraph, arranged in sentences, themselves arranged into words. I think that for our purposes, it's probably better to look again at the sentence in terms of our units of observation. So what would be the hypothesis that refines the previous one about symmetry versus isomorphism? I think that a way you could look at it, and this was also helpfully suggested or came out of exchanges with some of my viewers, is that instead of thinking of S statements as statements of symmetry, in other words, the words represent a situation literally, whereas in an N statement, the words represent the situation isomorphically with an element of metaphor in them. There's vagueness because sometimes S statements can be metaphorical, sometimes N statements can be literal. And it's also not quite clear that, like, N users, when they're hanging around in the world and they're referring to situations, regardless of the direction of fit of their statement, it's unclear that they would always be referring to isomorphic situations. It doesn't seem credible that if they make a statement about the Eiffel Tower, the statement is not going to be literal, because sometimes it's very clear that you have to make a literal statement in order to be understood, otherwise you'd be kind of crazed. So instead of thinking about literalism versus metaphor, or in terms of symmetry versus isomorphism, focusing our our observation on SE versus NE statements, I think that's potentially a helpful way of looking at it is in terms of what I would call semantic economy versus semantic expansionism, right? And it sounds technical, and I want to unpack a little bit of what that means. So I think that semantic economy is representative of SE statements, and or at least I hypothesize that SE statements are going to be defined by semantic economy, whereas NE statements are going to be defined and generally characterized by semantic expansionism, or you could also call it semantic minimalism versus semantic maximalism, or semantic intensity versus semantic extensity. The idea is semantic economy being that you have a particular situation and you want to refer to that situation to make a statement about it. Truth regime, mind to word to mind. We don't worry about that. Now, if the sentence referring, or the statement referring to the situation is semantically economical, what it means essentially is that the number of words that are semantically connected to the situation is going to be just nothing more than needs to be used in order to successfully refer to that situation. So if you have a situation, say like a state of affairs referring to, you want to refer to the Eiffel Tower and a bundle of things in relation to that, what's happening around the Eiffel Tower, whatever you want to say, an SE user is going to orient themselves to semantic economy in the sense that they will tend not to use more words that are needed to successfully refer to the situation in question. By comparison, or by contrast, semantic maximalism or semantic expansionism, which we would associate rather with an NE user, would be to say that generally the NE user, because of the makeup of their mind, because of their cognitive makeup, if you prefer, will have a tendency to very quickly generate extensionalist connections among referencing words whose meaning is connected to the situation, even though like a lot of those words might not be, they might be in excess. You know, there is an excess semantic reference in some sense. So the statement referring to the Eiffel Tower will contain all the words that are necessary to successfully do the referring, but they will generally contain other words, other references that are not necessary for successful reference. They're in addition to the successful reference. They add in some sense to the map, to the semantic richness of the statement, but they can also direct attention away from what they're actually trying to say in terms of making the reference successful. Because other people might just think, okay, they're referring to the Eiffel Tower, but they're also referring to the Empire State Building and something that happened the same year that Eiffel designed the Eiffel Tower, right? All semantically connected to the statement they were referring to, namely the Eiffel Tower. There's a semantic connection with the date at which Eiffel designed the Eiffel Tower. There's also a semantic connection with the Empire State Building in terms of, they're both skyscrapers or very tall buildings. So there is a semantic connection. It's not necessary to successful reference. The SE user generally will not tend to do that. They'll just use the words that are necessary to successfully refer to the situation. The NE user wants to do the same thing, but has a tendency to create these extensionalist parallel connections to other things, which will tend to mean that the surface that is reached in terms of the semantic connections is broader, and it can make it difficult to follow what they are, saying, or rather the guiding thread of what they're saying, because it's going in a lot of different directions. We know that these are descriptions of NE users that we see a lot in the literature already, but I think that it is interesting to look at it linguistically in terms of this semantic extension. That is, it's not a random generation of connections. The connection makes sense for the any user, because there's a semantic, there's a family, like this family of semantic meanings that are all connected with each other. And it's kind of the way that the any user works, that they're going to generate these connections and often include them in their statements, because these statements are, at least to some extent, going to reflect what's going on in their minds. Whereas the literalism of the SE user is a function of the fact that they do not operate in the same way, that their minds do not operate in the same way, and that usually when you have a particular situation, the SE user will perceive and think, I want to talk about this situation. What are the best words that I can use to successfully refer to that situation, accomplish my goal thereby? They're not going to spontaneously generate connections that are in excess of the successful reference. Their goal is a successful reference. Once a successful reference has been achieved, that's all they need. And so in this sense, they'll tend to be sparser in the sentences that they contribute, and they will tend to be more literal in this sense. Not literal in this case from an aesthetic viewpoint, but purely from the viewpoints of meaning, of the meaning of the words, and of the semantic region that they need to exploit in order to have the reference being successful. Any user, they'll usually have successful reference as well, but the success of that reference and the point of what they're trying to say can at times be shrouded by all this outer layer of related but not necessary meanings that come with it. Now that can be very creative, and that can make for great art, great argument, great philosophy, but it also explains this generous maximalism in the way that they express themselves and the connection between things. Now let me know in the comments what you think of this new hypothesis to replace the previous one. And don't forget that you can support me on Patreon too. And all the links are provided below. All the link to the pre-ordering of my new book, The Infinite Castle, the link to the Ecstatic Soul, the link to my first book, the link to Patreon. And yeah, thanks for watching. And I'll see you next week, guys. Bye-bye.